So this second ontological argument is really clever and really very sophisticated and very interesting. And it's hard to get that feeling that there's just some trick or obvious mistake here. If there is a mistake here, it's not obvious. Look, the argument seems to be valid. Each step does indeed seem to follow from the premises. So it looks like the only way out of this argument is going to be to criticize one or more premises as either false or unknown. Right, so let's just consider the four premises. They seem pretty tight. They seem pretty hard to deny. One of them is step 8 there. That's an independent premise. And the other two are, the other three are on this slide. Necessary existence is greater than contingent existence. We already saw that that is a plausible premise. One of those four options has to be true. Yep, those seem to be all the options. Either a thing exists or it doesn't, and either and its existence or non-existence is either necessary or contingent. God is by definition the greatest possible being, and remember, the only other premise is that God's existence does not involve a contradiction. So what is an atheist to do here? This guy here, this atheist, is pretty worried. The argument seems to be valid, each premise seems to be plausible, then we have to say the whole thing is sound and now believe that God exists. Well, we'll consider a couple of ways to object to it in a minute. If we try hard, there are some ways to object to it. But a couple more observations about the argument. It doesn't involve any weird theory of thought, so there's no two ways of existing here. In the mind only versus in reality. There are ways of existing, contingently existing or necessarily existing, but that seems to make perfect sense. Maybe the better way to put it would be there's no implausible theory of thinking here, so that thinking is having something exist in your mind. That seems to be a major advantage to the theory. So my objection to the previous argument just doesn't apply to this argument at all. Also, it doesn't assume that mere existence is a property. Is a property. It doesn't assume that, but it does assume that a thing is greater if it necessarily exists than if it contingently exists. It's plausible that necessary existence is a great-making property, isn't it? And again, it doesn't look like we're just defining something into existence, arguably. So the only weak spot it looks like one could attack this argument, I would say, is in premise 8. Premise 8 that says the claim that God exists doesn't imply a contradiction. Right, if we could show that 8 was false, then it would be an unsound argument. You wouldn't be able to get the conclusion from just those first three premises alone. There's a problem with this, though. You would have to show us the contradiction. Premise 8 says the claim that God exists doesn't imply a contradiction. The objection is that's false. So in other words, we're saying the claim that God exists does imply a contradiction. Now by itself it's not contradictory. God exists. That's not like saying there's a square circle, right? Does it imply a contradiction? Well, not obviously. Someone is going to have to show us how to derive a contradiction from the claim that God exists in order to make this line of attack work. There are a few philosophers out there that hold that there's something demonstrably contradictory about the concept of a greatest possible being, but I've never thought they had much a case, to be honest. It usually involves some controversial definition of a divine attribute or so on. That's maybe an avenue worth looking into if you suspect that there is something contradictory about the concept of the greatest possible being. I'm not aware of any contradiction, though. Unless we can show that there's a contradiction, then this is just a bluff. Now there's more hope maybe for this. Okay, say we don't have to argue that 8 is false. Remember, you can say that, well, whether 8 is true or false, we don't know 8. Nobody knows 8. And so the point of this objection would be that the argument is not cogent to us. Maybe not cogent to anybody, or at least not to us. The argument needn't persuade us. We don't know that it's sound. We don't know that it's sound because we don't know that premise 8 is true. Now, why do people think that premise 8 is true? Just because when they think about the concept of a greatest possible being, it seems consistent. And it doesn't seem inconsistent. Now, that's not the end of the matter, though. But at this point, I'm going to put the ball in your court. How might you attack or defend premise 8? As known or as not known? What kind of evidence could there be that's relevant to premise 8? It looks like if premise 8 is true, the argument is sound. More to the point, if we know that 8 is true, arguably we know that 1 through 3 are true, and that the argument's valid. It looks like if we know premise 8, then the argument would be cogent to us, and we should all believe in a perfect being. So maybe it's very hard to show the argument is unsound. This would be good enough to show that the argument's not cogent. You could then reasonably not go along with the conclusion, say, well, this argument doesn't persuade me. Close, but no banana. But the question is, how could you establish that premise 8 is not known? We'll talk about it.